this evening. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. And tonight we're going to be looking at chapters 3 and 4 of 2 Samuel. And it basically, those two chapters just end up talking about death. Death of Abner and the death of Ishbaal. So this is the chronology of David, and here we are, right about right between the anointing as king of Judah and the anointing as king over all of Israel. So and notice that it takes about 7 years in there before David is finally anointed as king of all Israel. And here we are in this timeline. We're finishing off with basically up to the point where David then becomes king over a united Israel. And next week then we'll get into that, and start off with his basically with the good parts of David's reign up to chapter 10, and then after that, let's just say he hits a plateau both morally and physically in his reign. So we're still on the upswing with David then. All right, so let me go ahead, and here we are. This is where we're going to be talking about tonight, the physical areas where we're going to be talking about. And you'll see up here at Mahanaim is where they call him Ishbaal. It's the same name as Ishbosheth. Is just another name for Ishbaal, Ishbaal. Just that is Saul's son that ascended to the throne because his 3 other sons died on Mount Gilboa. And then here is where David demands that he gets Michal back, his wife, his first wife. And then down here in Hebron is where David reigns from. He is the king of Judah, and this area down here is all Judah, and so he is the king there in Hebron. And so if you ever been down there, it's pretty nice. A lot of forest around there. It's a pretty nice place. Okay, so what do we have in chapter 3? We've got David's strength is increasing. It says, now the war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. While David grew stronger, the house of Saul grew steadily weaker. And so we know that from the time that David was crowned king of Judah until he was actually then crowned king of Israel, and therefore all of the nation of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, that was about 7 years or so, 7.5 years. And then chapter 3 gives a list of David's wives and offspring. Kind of a thing is just kind of inserted in there. And then we talk about Abner and Ishbosheth, and we'll get into that. And so Abner then leaves Ishbosheth and just basically goes over to David's side, and David accepts that, and then of course Joab murders Abner. And so let's go ahead and read the first 5 verses. Now the war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. While David grew steadily stronger, the house of Saul grew steadily weaker. Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam of Jezreel. The second was Heliab by Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. The third one was Absalom, son of Michal, daughter of King Talmai of Geshur. The fourth was Adonijah, son of Haggith. The fifth was Shephatiah, son of Abital, and the sixth Ithream by David's wife Eglah. These were born to David in Hebron. So here he had like 6 wives or something like that, and it just seems kind of like an insert into the story. But this does, it just kind of tells us the progressive shift of power from the house of Saul, he's diminishing, to that of David's kingship, where he is actually then a fulfillment of Samuel's prophecy in the 15th chapter of Samuel. So during this extended example here, I mean, this extended conflict, there were there was not a succession of many battles, but just an atmosphere of constant hostility, kind of like a Cold War, only just it was more like a lukewarm war, not really all out war. And Abner's attention, of course, was directed against the encroaching demands of the Philistines. Remember that he lost most of his soldiers in the battle that resulted in Saul's death, and so he obviously would doubtlessly have been less and less successful against the Philistines. So maybe that failure was the basic reason that lay beside Abner's decision to switch allegiance to David. Because of all the things we know about Abner, he was an opportunist. He looked out for Abner first, and he wanted to be king himself, and we know that because it talks about him taking one of Saul's concubines, and that was kind of that was in the Middle Eastern time, the time frame. That was, if you were going to be the new king, then you took over the old king's harem, and so if he were to have a child from that union of one of those ladies, then that child would have more of a legitimacy, because he was not only the child of the guy, the wannabe king, the new king or whatever, but he was also a child of one of the wives of the old king. So that's the way they figured it back then anyway. So anyway, he probably figured that, okay, if he could do that, then that would maybe put him in a better position for the throne, because he knew Ishbosheth was a weak guy, and there was no heir apparent after Ishbosheth, because of the folks that were there were not in any that were remaining were not in any position to take over the throne. So in verse 6, during the war between the house of Saul and David, and the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner strengthened his position in the house of Saul. Now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why have you slept with my daughter's concubine?" But Abner became very angry over Ishbosheth's words and said, "Am I a dog's head from Judah? To this day I've been loyal to the house of Saul, your father, to his kinsmen and to his friends, and I haven't handed you over to David. Yet today you are accusing me of wrongdoing with this woman. May God do so to Abner, and even more if, as Adonijah has sworn to David, I don't accomplish this for him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and establish the throne of David over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba." But Ishbosheth could not respond to Abner with another word, because he was afraid of him. So here we see the weakness of Ishbosheth. Now, Abner was the strong man of Israel. Ishbosheth seemed like just a figurehead. He was king in name only. And so far, Abner's loyalty to the house of Saul was clear, but here's the conflict between him and Ishbosheth, and as I explained before, that the king's concubines, in the Middle East, the king's concubines were his means of raising up heirs if the queen could not bear children, or even if she could. So Ishbosheth regarded Abner's act as a sign of loyalty. He seemed to be trying to have an heir by a royal concubine who could have, according to custom, become king one day. We don't know whether this was Abner's plan or not. His implied denial, he implied denial of that motive, but not the act. He says, "Well, I." As far as the motive, he uh, denied that, but maybe not the act of it. Yeah, so I went to bed with this gal. So what? In any case, the incident, it shifted their loyalty, his loyalty, Abner's loyalty, from Ishbosheth, then basically over to David. He figured, okay, I cannot win this throne, but I can certainly ingratiate myself to the guy that's going to be the king, and still keep my position secure. So Abner, he acknowledged explicitly in all of this that he knew that it was God's will that David would succeed Saul, and so basically Abner was kind of setting up Ishbosheth, and so we see that Abner was a schemer. He was really looking out for himself. Any comments or questions about this guy so far? Now he did there's a good bit in the Hebrew that um, uh, Abner, spoke about him. I had dog's head or something like that. That basically it was a slur that he would be. He's asking Ishbosheth, "Do you think I'm um, a a dog or basically the slur is a male prostitute, prostituting myself to King David so that I can get at you." That's what his what was that was what he was meaning there, because one of the slang words for a male prostitute was a dog. Um, so um, let's just say that the canines did not enjoy the uh, the exalted position that they do today in American households. Okay, where um, they're everywhere, and they get the best spot. They get the best spot on the sofa and everything. Okay, so going ahead to verse 12. Then Abner sent messengers to David on his behalf and says, "Whose is the land? Make your covenant with me, and see, my hand will be with you to bring all Israel over to you." "Good," said David, "I will cut a covenant with you, but one thing I require of you: you will not see my face until you first bring Saul's daughter Michal when you come to see my face." Then David sent messengers to Saul's son Ishbosheth, demanding, "Give me my wife Michal, who I'm betrothed to myself, for 100 Philistine foreskins." So Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband Paltiel, son of Laish, but her husband accompanied her, weeping as he went, and followed her as far as Bahurim. Then um, Abner said to him, "Go, return." So he returned. Um, and so um, there's something that where I just wanted to bring out here, that you just think of, okay, why was it that or what was the relationship between Joab and David? Now remember, David was the youngest son of Jesse, and so Jesse's David had a sister, also a half sister, Abigail and Zariah, however you say that. And so Joab was David's nephew. You can see that here, and then here's the references to those. And so Joab actually could have been the same age, even though he was a nephew. He could have been the same age as David, or even perhaps older than David. And uh, he had really hitched his wagon to that star David there. He could see that, and so um, that's why David was so reluctant to take care of the sin in his own camp, because Joab was his nephew. And if I mean, had he done something to Joab, I'm sure that his sister Zeruiah would not be coming to Thanksgiving dinner that year. So um, David agreed with an alliance to an alliance um, with Abner, and he said, one of the things that I want you to do is to bring my wife, Michal, back to you. I want her returned. And so, you know, I've read, I don't know how many commentators, half a dozen of them or more, and a lot of them, some of them say, "Oh yeah, this just shows the deep love that David had for his first wife," and even though he had these six other ones, he wanted the wife of his youth, his first wife, and how deeply he loved her, and so on and so forth. Um, and then others were a little bit more cynical, like me, that said, no, this looks more like a political kind of a thing. He was trying to get her back, and because of if he got his wife back, that would show his strength. And so he sent word to Ishbosheth and said, "Hey, I want my wife back." And sure, remember that then Michal would have been Ishbosheth's sister, sort of. I mean, they had the same father, and I don't know who they're, probably not the same mother, but anyway, they had the same father. And so, remarkably, Ishbosheth said, "Yeah, okay," and he basically took her away from her husband, whom he had been married to. She'd been married to them for at this point, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, something like that. And um, so obviously the husband was deeply in love with Michal, because he followed her even though she was carried off. He followed her behind until finally uh, Ishbosheth issued orders to him, says, "Leave, get out of here." And so I mean that's kind of a sad story, a sad tale, of, if you ask me, about this guy that has his wife taken away from him. And really, the marriage between David and Michal, even though they were married, she was not the most supportive of wives, and in fact later on would mock him. And um, so that's kind of how that went. I just personally think it was probably a political move that would further cement David's claim on the throne of Saul, because he was married. He was the father-in-law of Saul, and so it was a political thing. And who knows? Hey, if I was a little bit more romanticized, I guess I would say that, yeah, he really loved her and he brought her back, and for all of that, and you know, that would have been a great homecoming. Hey, ladies, all you six of my other wives, I want you to meet my first wife, the one that I loved before all of you guys. So, gals. So yeah, that I don't know how that Middle Eastern wife thing went with all of the ladies and so forth. That would have it would have made life interesting for sure. All right. Going ahead with verse 17. Now Abner had a word with the elders of Israel, saying, "In times past, you wanted to be king. You wanted David to be king over you. Now, so now do it. For Adonijah has spoken of David, saying, By the hand of my servant David, I will deliver my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies." And Abner also spoke in the hearing of Benjamin. Then Abner, Benjamin, meaning the tribe of Benjamin. Then Abner went to Hebron to speak in the hearing of David about all that was agreeable to Israel and to the whole house of Benjamin. So, evidently, after the death of Saul, there had been an attempt to make David the king of Israel, but David's involvement with the Philistines and probably Abner's own personal ambition had stopped that effort. And then Abner went to these elders and he said, actually, he kind of expanded the beyond anything that was said in the Bible. Um, he mentioned that the Lord's promise that David would deliver the Israelites from the hand of the Philistines. Okay, that kind of gives us a clue as to where Abner's mind was. He was trying to get somebody that could take the Philistines off their back, and uh, so David. Here he is. He's trying to sell David now to these elders, and he gets a little hyperbolic there with some of the things that he thought that, or telling the people that God had said, so that they would then accept David. It still took a long time. It was not a this from the time that David was crowned in Judah until the time he took over Israel was 7 years. So um, it was one of those deals where Abner had not been successful against the Philistines, and now here's a way that says, look, David was always real successful against the Philistines, so um, let's go ahead and make him our king, and then we can get these guys off our back, because Israel really needed a deliverer at that point. So uh, Abner was actively fomenting a coup against Ishbosheth, and a lot of people may have just you could call it treachery or treason or whatever, but Abner was the strongest guy in Israel at the time. Ishbosheth was very, very weak. So he lobbied for David with Israel's leading men, and said, "Hey, you guys used to like David, you wanted him, and now let's go ahead and yeah, I know what we said before, that he was with the Philistines or not, but okay, times have changed. We got to get him on. We need to bring him and make him our king." So, but he did recognize that God had made the promise that David would be the king, and he had to really sell this to the Benjamites, because remember, Saul was a Benjamite. Benjamin was the smallest of all the tribes, and so um, they it would have they had to be convinced, because Saul had been their man. That it's amazing that the smallest tribe of Israel, in all of Israel, would have produced the first king. So now there are a lot of reasons why Joab disliked Abner. Um, he hated him because they were rival commander in chief, and because he evidently had superior character in some respects. He also opposed Abner because he was a threat to Joab's career advancement if the alliance went through. Mostly Joab opposed Abner because why? Abner had killed his brother Asahel in battle. Remember our little chart here. Here's Joab and here's Asahel. That's his brother. And so we see then that that's why it's really after Abner, is because Abner had killed his own brother. Now, although it killed him in battle. So then Joab actually murdered Abner in a city of refuge, which was totally against the law, because a city in a city of refuge, a person who had killed someone else, not premeditated murder, but had somehow manslaughter, then the relatives could go out and take revenge on that person unless he could get to a city of refuge, and then he could live in the city of refuge until the high priest died. Once the high priest died and was replaced, then it was no longer lawful for any family members to go against the person who had killed one of their family members. So maybe Abner was too he thought he was too important in David's eyes to actually suspect that anyone would come against him. And plus, I mean, he'd killed Asahel, and in all fairness, he'd killed Asahel in battle, even after the point of telling him, "Hey, get away from me! I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to kill you. Go kill somebody else, or go fight somebody else and take their armor, because I don't want to I don't want to fight with you, because if I do, I'll kill you." And Asahel persisted, and so the outcome of it was that Abner actually did kill Asahel. So then Joab and his brother then swore vengeance against Abner. And so David was very careful not to let everyone know that Abner's murder was Joab's doing and not his. And so if it had been David's doing, then he would have maybe lost the support of the northern tribes. Any comments or questions so far at this point? Okay. Then in verse 20, when Abner came to David in Hebron along with 20 other men, David held a banquet for Abner and the men with him. Abner said to David, "Let me go up and go rally all Israel to my lord the king, so that they may cut a covenant with you, and you may reign over all that your soul desires." So David sent Abner away, and he departed in shalom. Now, there's one big thing that's wrong with this arrangement, and that was the fact that although David knew of Joab's murderous hatred of Abner, I mean, they were relatives, and Joab was David's main man. He knew that Joab was going to be after Abner because Abner had killed his brother. He did not tell Joab about his dealings with Abner at this point. Maybe because of that hatred, but he didn't tell him. He didn't brief him on what was happening with Abner. And some people say that maybe David actually sent Joab out on these raids against their enemies, the Amalekites, or the whateverites that were out there. Maybe the Philistines, sent him out on this so that he would have time in Hebron with Abner and could have a visit with Abner. We don't know, but at the same time, I mean, we just do know that Abner came down and they had a meeting with David and said, "Look, let me go on back, and we'll bring the rest of Israel to you and make you the king of all Israel." And David said, "Yeah, let's do it." And he sent him away in peace. It says in shalom. Then verse 22. Then just then David's soldiers and Joab came from a raid, bringing with them much spoil. By then, Abner was no longer with David in Hebron, for he had sent him away, and he departed in Shalom. When Joab and all the soldiers with him arrived, they told Joab, saying, Abner, son of Ner, came to the king, and he has sent him away. He has gone in Shalom, third time now, saying he's gone in peace. Then Joab came to the king, said, what have you done? Look here, Abner came to you. Why did you send him away? Now he's getting away. You know Abner, son of Ner, surely he came to deceive you, to spy on your goings and comings, and to find out all you were doing. All right. David left Joab out of the loop when dealing with Abner. And so Joab had that axe to grind because Abner had killed his brother. And this type of revenge, remember, was not allowable. And so Joab thought David should not be making a covenant with Abner and should instead have arrested him and executed him. So, so here Joab is making his case for to just break up any kind of an agreement between David and Abner. If you didn't know the family dealings here and the familial relationships between Joab and David, you'd think, how in the world, if David is the king, that his top general, even though he's his top general, can come in there and screaming and yelling at the king, tell him, what are you thinking? This is dumb. You just let your enemy get away. He's spying on you, and that's a far cry from the days, in some other places, like when Esther was around, several hundred years later, and she couldn't even come to see her husband, the king, unless he sent for her, or if she walked in there. If he didn't extend his scepter to her, then she would be executed. And so, but here you got David, and his even though it's his number one man, could come in there and berate David for making that kind of a deal with a suspected enemy. And but you just got to go back. It's that the blood is thicker than water. So going ahead, verse 26, when Joab left David, he sent messengers after Abner, so that they brought him back from the well of Sirah, though David knew nothing about it. Now, when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside within the gate to speak with him privately, and there stabbed him in the groin, in the stomach, actually in the abdomen, so that he died on account of the blood of his brother Asahel. So there we have it. That's the real reason why he did this. When David heard about it afterward, he said, I and my kingdom are innocent before Adonai forever from the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May it whirl on Joab's head and on all his father's house. May the house of Joab never be without someone with discharge or tzarat, lame, or fallen by the sword, or one who lacks food. And so Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel at Gibeon in battle. So here's the real reason. You can only think David was pretty helpless at this point. He was in kind of the same position that Ishbosheth was. Even though David was strong, Ishbosheth was weak. Both of them had generals who were very strong, and without whom their position as king would have been very rocky. David was dependent on Joab because he commanded his army and probably had a loyalty of his own. The only difference is that Joab was loyal to what he believed to be the interest of the king, whereas Abner had, he had changed his loyalty. He had been loyal to Ishbosheth, or at least or loyal to himself, or whatever. And now he had left Ishbosheth and defected over to David. So there's that idea that we see that Abner was kind of an opportunist. I put Abner and Joab pretty much in the same boat, really. That both of them looked out for themselves, but there again, that's not the opinion of many of the commentators, who they would lift Joab up a little bit higher than Abner, because they thought Abner was a lout. And so the curse that David invoked on the house of Joab, he couldn't really kill him or punish him or anything, but he could just pronounce a curse on him. And it basically it culminated with the Solomon's slaughter of Joab between the horns of the altar. Remember, we'll get onto that later on in the book of 2 Samuel, because Joab backed Adonijah to be the successor of David rather than Solomon. And among David's last words, in fact, were that he admonished Solomon not to allow the gray hairs of Joab to go down to the grave in peace. The incredible damage to the entire history of Israel, which resulted from the assassination of Abner, it just can't be overestimated. The eventual division of the kingdom in the reign of Rehoboam was due in part to the mistrust and the hatred that followed this action between the action of Joab and Abishai. So anytime that you deal treacherously with people, it does come back. It comes back on you. So any comments or questions? Okay, well, I had to get a drink anyway. So finishing this chapter off, then David said to Joab, to all the people who were with him, rend your clothes, gird with sackcloth, and lament before Abner. King David walked behind the platform when they buried Abner in Hebron. The king lifted up his voice and wept aloud at Abner's grave, and all the people wept. Then the king chanted a lament for Abner and said, should Abner die like a senseless fool? Your hands were not bound, your feet were never in fetters. As one falls before the children of iniquity, so did you fall. Then all the people wept again after him. Then all the people came to urge David to eat some food while it was still day, but David vowed, saying, may God do so to me and even more if I taste food or anything else before the sun sets. All the people took note of it and pleased him, just as everything the king did pleased all the people. So all the people and all Israel understood that day that it was not the king's will to kill Abner, son of Ner. Then the king said to his soldiers, don't you realize that a prince and a great man has fallen in Israel today? So today I am vulnerable, even though anointed king. These men, the sons of Zariah, are too hard for me to handle. May Adonai reward the evildoer according to his wickedness. Again, this is incredible stuff here. David, he did put on he was a politician. Let's just face it, David had to be a politician. And so he had to show genuine, sincere remorse for the killing of Abner. He put on a big funeral. Abner had been ambitious. He had probably kept David from the throne for several years because he wanted it himself, and he was treacherous. But had David killed him, then the crown would not go to David. It just Abner held too much sway up there in Israel, and they would not have allowed that. it still took years to convince the elders in Israel to accept David as their legitimate king. So that would have made it even worse. And so from this what do you call a soliloquy or a eulogy or something, that it's even afterwards, David said to his soldiers, don't you realize that a prince and a great man has fallen in Israel today? So this line here, a prince and a great man has fallen today. uh, you see that in state funerals, even today, 3,500 years later, we're still using that same language to describe uh, people of prominence when they die. And so David, again, by his fasting, that showed that his remorse, and so it said all the people took note of it. Again, I think what is all the people? It's that is a it's hyperbolic language a little bit, because it's kind of like, yeah, we celebrated uh, Shavuot at our house yesterday, and everybody was there. Well, no, not everybody was there. We had almost 50, but that was, that's the that's the way that the Bible is written. So all the people took notice of everything that David did pleased all the people. And so you get that, but it gives you the idea of the general consensus that people did approve of David. It's sad, but even though David was strong and decisive when dealing with his enemies of Israel, he was very weak and indecisive when dealing with his own family. He just didn't do it harshly enough or strongly enough with his own family. Um, Now going into verse in chapter 4, and here's where the action from chapter 4 takes place. It's basically the same two places. Mahanaim up here where Ishbosheth was, or Ishbaal, and then down here in Eglon, Hebron, where David was. And so these uh, going ahead with verse 1 there in chapter 4. Now, when Saul's son heard that Abner had died in Hebron, his courage sank, and all of the Israelites were disturbed. Again, that the business of all the Israelites were disturbed. I would imagine many of the Israelites never even had a clue, but for the most part, it says Israel was disturbed. Saul's son had two men who were commanders of raiding bands. The name of one was Baanah and the other one was Rechab, and sons of Rimmon the Beerothite of the sons of Benjamin, for Beeroth is considered part of Benjamin, though the Beerothites had fled to Gittaim and live there as outsiders to this day. So Ishbosheth and Israel lost Abner. He was their strong man. So this really deflated Ishbosheth, and from his position over here in this area between Reuben and Gad, that's where he was trying to rule from. He was kind of isolated anyway. So we can kind of infer from these guys, the two assassins there, Baanah and Rechab, were not Israelites per se, but Amorites or Canaanites. Their father came from a Gibeonite city, and they were mercenaries in Ishbosheth's army. So the story of the Gibeonites, if you remember from Joshua 9, they had deceived Joshua into when Joshua was starting the conquering. They deceived him by coming in old clothes, making them look like they had traveled for a long way, and that they were not from the land, and they were from a distant land, and they just wanted a peace treaty with them. Joshua did that, and um, yeah, basically the Gibeonites were spared from annihilation or banishment from when the Israelites came into Canaan. So the Gibeonites were they were savagely persecuted by Saul, and he put many of them to death. And so that could account for the basic hatred of Saul's house that would have motivated these two brothers to murder Ishbosheth. And as a result of that persecution, the Gibeonites had fled to Gittaim, the town of the Beeroth. You see Beeroth here and Gittaim there. We really don't know the actual location of those, but the town of Beeroth was in the tribe of Benjamin. So now we have a parenthetical verse here, verse 4. Saul's son Jonathan had a son whose legs were crippled. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, and it came about as she was hurrying to flee that he fell and was crippled. His name was Mephibosheth. Now this is like I said, a parenthetical, and it introduces Mephibosheth, and he tells you that he had a disability. In other words, he was crippled. He could not have sensibly been a successor to the throne, and because he couldn't lead people in battle and so forth. This was, remember, the old days when you expected the king to be out there in the front of the troops in the battle, and not like a lot of modern battles where the actual president or generals or whatever can be hundreds or thousands of miles away from the battlefront. So now that going on then with verse 5, now the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, Rechab and Baanah set out and came to the house of Ishbosheth at the heat of the day, as he was taking a midday nap. When he came within the house as though to get wheat, they stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and his brother Baanah escaped. All right, these mercenaries, they were mercenary raiders. They were employees of Ishbosheth, and so he had probably paid them to go raid the Philistines, and so they had sworn their allegiance to him, even though it was basically an allegiance bound in money, maybe. But their action to kill the king there, Ishbosheth, was very, very criminal, and so their motivation could very well have been, as before, why with Saul's persecution of the Gibeonites. But their intention also, you can see from their actions afterwards, was very self-seeking, like the Amalekite that had taken the head of Saul down to David, or the crown and the armlet, and the head. They suppose that with such a deed they would be in a place where they were ingratiating themselves with David, then that they would be richly rewarded for that. But we know how David was. When they had gotten within the house, he was lying on his bed in his bedroom. They stabbed him, killed him, then beheaded him, took his head, traveled by the way of the Arabah all night. Then they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David in Hebron and said to the king, "Here is the head of Saul's son Ishbosheth, your enemy, who sought your life. Today Adonijah has avenged my lord, the king of Saul, and his offspring. Um, so these guys, again, they were mercenaries. They would sell out their own mothers for the right price. They were not loyal to David. They were loyal to themselves, and that's all they were. And so they had killed Ishbosheth. They took his head. They traveled by way of from up here, traveled right along the Arabah, which that is the Jordan River, Jordan Valley down here, and then they crossed over. This crossing here was probably, that's a famous ford of crossing here, and then went on down to where Hebron was. That was a good long hike for them to do that, but they brought it down to David in Hebron. Then David answered Rechab and his brother Baanah, sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, saying, "As Adonai lives, who redeemed my soul out of all distress, when someone informed me, 'Look, Saul is dead,' thinking he was a bearer of good news, I seized him and killed him in Ziklag, instead of rewarding him for his news. How much more then? How much more when wicked men have killed a righteous person in his own house on his bed? Should I now require his blood from your hands and rid the earth of you?" Then David commanded the young men, and they slew them, cut off their hands and their legs, hung them up beside the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the grave of Abner in Hebron. So when David uh, when he designated Ishbosheth not as the king of Israel, but as a righteous man, there's a little dig there in a way, because he was implicitly just calling him a righteous man rather than the king of Israel. So even though as the son of Saul, he had a claim to the throne, he had not been anointed as David had been. And so David's treatment of the two corpses of the two murderers and that of Ishbosheth showed the people that Ishbosheth's murder was not an act that he had ordered or approved of, because he took these guys and then had their bodies mutilated and hung up on a wall, and or hung up by a pool or something, and somehow they were hung up for people to see. But with Ishbosheth, they went and took his head, which is all they had, and they buried it along with Abner in the same tomb as with Abner. So David, he had every right to be outraged, actually, and disgusted with these two treacherous guys, and because they were supposed to be protecting Ishbosheth, and but he made 3 points in his response. First, he referred to his own experience of the ways of the Lord giving the lie to their claim of having been the Lord's tools in this brutal murder. Remember, they said that we have avenged, the Lord. How did they say that? Look, well, I've already lost it. Here's the head of Saul's son Ishbosheth, your enemy who sought your life. Today, Adonai, invoking the name of Adonai, has avenged my lord, the king of Saul and his offspring. So first, David said, "Okay, no, I'm the one that acts in the name of Adonai." And then his point number 2, he told him about how that when the Amalekite had come back with Saul's head and saying that, "Yes, I killed him," then actually he didn't come back with Saul's head. It was a crown and the amulet or the armband, because Saul's body and head were separated up there, and they stayed up there. But his third point was that Ishbosheth was a righteous man, contrasting actually that with Saul, who was a wicked guy, and by the time that David had gotten to that point in his reply to these guys, I would imagine that these guys had figured out that okay, we made a big mistake, and this is not going to go end well for us. And indeed, it did not. But again, David had them executed and then mutilated their bodies, which was a big insult in Middle Eastern culture. In fact, it's even today. Um, it's considered by civilized countries that you don't mutilate or desecrate corpses of your enemy, and we've seen that from the treatment of our own soldiers, that just the mere act of taking pictures with the corpses of some of our enemies have caused them a lot of grief. And but we do see the stark difference again between the treatment of these murderers and the Joab, who was a murderer who killed Abner. Um, David had these guys killed and mutilated, and Abner, he's still right there uh, doing what Abner does. Joab, he's doing what Joab does. He's the king's nephew, and he's also the head of the king's army, and so that's eventually gonna bite David, but that's years down the road, and we'll see that in further episodes.